Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Wednesday, the 3rd of July. In London, I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Sunak and Starmer make their final pitches to voters as polling suggests a record-breaking Labour win.
Biden blames jet lag for his disastrous debate performance, as one report suggests the president's lapses are becoming more common.
Plus, Le Pen's path narrows. Parties opposing the far right in France unite in a bid to deny the National Rally an outright majority.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has made a last-minute campaign push to rally Conservative voters. In his first public appearance this campaign, Johnson urged supporters to avert a Conservative wipeout.
Do you think this country really wants to give Starmer that kind of mandate? I don't think they do, and yet Labour are so cocky that they're so complacent, they're so smug, they're barely concealing their agenda anymore. And we can see what it is. Whacking up taxes on pensions, on property, persecuting private enterprise, attacking private education.
Boris Johnson isn't standing as a candidate in this election. He led his party to victory in 2019 but was ousted by them following a series of scandals. The Conservative Party has urged its voters to avoid giving Labour a supermajority, or what they have called a, quote, blank cheque.
Labour leader Keir Starmer dismissed the Conservatives' strategy as, quote, desperate. The frontrunner in the polls was sticking to a familiar message of no complacency.
We go forward into the last yards, the last days. And you know what they say? The last yards are the hardest. It's really, really hard now. Nothing must be taken for granted. Every vote has to be earned. The polls don't predict the future.
Despite Starmer's words, Bloomberg's composite poll of polls sees Labour ahead of every other party by at least 20 points. Keir Starmer has raised an ambitious goal of increasing economic growth in the UK to 2.5% by reforming Britain's paralysed planning system and spurring the transition to net zero.
The next government could save billions of pounds for the Treasury by making drastic changes to operations at the Bank of England. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has the story.
According to strategists at firms including Barclays and Citigroup, an overhaul of the country's quantitative easing programme could stem mounting losses on central bank dues. The change would involve the government selling less debt to finance its spending, causing bonds to climb and yields to drop. Barclays estimates the accounting shift could free up £20 billion a year, funds which could be used to meet costly spending pledges. But markets might not react so positively if the move is seen as diminishing central bank independence. Over 20 years since the last incoming Labour government shocked the markets by surrendering control of interest rates to a newly independent Bank of England in 1997. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
President Biden has blamed global travel and jet lag for his disastrous debate performance against Donald Trump. In June, the US leader went to France for the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings and returned to Europe days later for the G7 summit, which was then followed by a trip to LA. Speaking to donors, Biden said that he didn't listen to his staff and as a result, quote, nearly fell asleep on stage. But prominent Democrats are now beginning to wonder aloud about the president's mental state. Here is the former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi on MSNBC yesterday.
So he has a vision, he has knowledge, he has judgment, he has a strategic thinking and the rest. He has a bad night. Now, again, I think it's a legitimate question to say, is this an episode or is this a condition? And so when people ask that question, it's completely legitimate of both candidates.
Nancy Pelosi's comments on MSNBC come as the New York Times reported that some officials and associates of the president are concerned that Biden's instances of confusion or listlessness have grown more frequent and more pronounced.
In France, parties opposing the far right are manoeuvring to try to keep the National Rally out of power in the second round of parliamentary elections on Sunday. Candidates from centrist and left-wing parties have pulled out in around 2/3 of runoff races to provide a single opponent to the far right, which won the highest share of the vote in the first round. Speaking to Bloomberg, the former ECB President Jean-Claude Trichet has predicted more cooperation among parties.
I think that a technocratic government is not in the French tradition at all. It might be a solution in other countries, namely Italy. What I would expect, I think that the president would probably try to have a coalition government.
Jean-Claude Trichet speaking there. French government bonds have gained on the news of the revised candidate lists. The spread between German and French borrowing costs narrowed to 71 basis points on Tuesday. That's the tightest on a closing basis since mid-June. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has acknowledged the central bank has made quite a bit of progress in reducing inflation. But speaking at the ECB forum in Sintra in Portugal, he emphasised officials would like to see more data before lowering interest rates.
We want to be more confident that inflation is moving sustainably down toward 2% before we start the process of reducing how tight our policy is, of loosening policy. That's what we've said, and what we'd like to see is more data like what we've been seeing recently. We'd also like to see the labor market remain strong. We've said that if we saw the labor market unexpectedly weakening, that is also something that could call for a reaction.
Jerome Powell speaking there in Portugal. The Fed's preferred measure of underlying inflation rose by just 0.1% in May. That's the smallest advance in 6 months. But US job openings unexpectedly rose in data out on Tuesday, bucking the trend of a slowdown in the labour market, which is seen as key to easing. Traders await US initial jobless claims and ADP employment data out later today.
And there's been another day of records on the US stock market. With details, here is Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
For the first time in its history, the S&P 500 closed above 5,500 to extend a blistering 2024 rally that has left analysts scrambling to update their targets. It was the gauge's 32nd record this year. The Nasdaq 100 hit the 20,000 mark, also notching a record. Equities have defied doomsayers amid solid corporate earnings, the artificial intelligence mania, and expectations that interest rates will drop. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
Now, in a moment, we're going to bring you the latest on the UK election campaign and also renewed fears among Democrats about Joe Biden's re-election campaign, but also a word on the latest in another election, of course, that we've been following very closely. This around France, the deadline last night.
Yeah, look, this is the key moment now in the space between the two rounds of the French parliamentary election. We had more than 300 three-way races going into the second round. The lower-priced candidate from centrist and left-wing parties, and now the majority of those, 2/3 of them in fact, have pulled out in an effort to block the far right from getting elected. This is the return of a principle in French politics known as the Republican Front, where you have parties unite, taking advantage of the two-round system to try and keep the extremes out of power. The question though now is whether or not voters will follow those trends. Will the people whose candidate has pulled out, be it a left-wing one or a centrist one, be tempted to vote for the other candidate that's not the far right? And that's something that's certainly much less certain when you listen to political analysts in France talking about it. You've still got around 100 though of these three-way races that are continuing into the second round. That's also unprecedented in French elections. The previous record for these races was 77 of them, so we're still likely to have a record number going into this. Our colleagues have been writing about what this means for the far right's bid for power in France. Le Pen faces an uphill struggle to get a majority in the French election. Plenty more to read on that on Bloomberg.com and on the terminal.
Well, here in the UK, it's the final day of campaigning for the general election. It's been dominated, of course, by Labour's poll lead and the rise of Reform UK. Our UK correspondent Lizzie Burden joins us now for more. Good morning, Lizzie. Labour has had this commanding lead in the polls for weeks, but also for months before the general election was actually called. You've been looking at how this might turn out when it comes to seat numbers.
Yes, so the bookmakers have given us various scenarios in order of likelihood. These are according to Betfair Exchange, so let me set them out for you. The most likely scenario is an unprecedented 250 plus seat majority for Labour, which, Caroline, was barely conceivable 5 years ago after the last election, when, you'll remember, Jeremy Corbyn led Labour to absolute annihilation. But the latest polling suggests that we are on for a supermajority here. This is a term that has been imported into the British parliamentary lexicon by the Conservatives to warn against Labour having untrammelled power. Starmer has said it smacks of desperation from the Conservatives, but he would be able to pass his legislation pretty freely without having to worry about rebellion from within his own party. The question is how much pressure Starmer would come under to be more radical in his economic plans. Bloomberg Economics says that it could actually be a boon for the UK economy because the Institute for Fiscal Studies, you'll remember, has said that actually at the moment he's kind of gambling on growth. Now, the second most likely scenario would be a landslide of only 150 plus seat majority, which would still be a huge win for Keir Starmer. He could still pass his legislation. And to put it in context, Labour's best ever result was in 1997 when Tony Blair got a 179 seat majority. This scenario would still be about double Boris Johnson's 80 seat majority in 2019. The difference is it would mean that actually the Conservatives wouldn't face extinction. And let me just run through you the last scenario, a narrower Labour win of a 50-seat majority. Once upon a time, this would have been a big deal, Caroline. Back before Boris Johnson's Partygate, Liz Truss's 49-day premiership. But now, with expectations so high, it would be seen as a bit of a disappointment. And I can tell you now, the headlines on Friday would be all about how the Conservatives managed to stave off a massive defeat and what on earth went wrong for Keir Starmer.
What about this return of Boris Johnson to the campaign trail, Lizzie? We haven't been hearing from him. Could this be something that'll help to save the Tories from a crushing defeat?
Well, remember, he's not running as an MP this time. He was once known as the Heineken politician who could reach the parts of the electorate no one else could reach. And he's been repeating this line about not surrendering to a Labour supermajority. Will it help, you ask? Well, he is divisive. There's a reason that he's not running to be Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak is, but it reminds voters that Gamblegate, as it's being known, is the story now, and Partygate was the story of Boris Johnson. As Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor, put it to us on Bloomberg, that was when the rot set in. But here we have the Conservatives making a last roll of the dice because things are really desperate.
Yeah, OK, Lizzie, thank you so much for being with us. Our UK correspondent, Lizzie Burden.
We're to US politics now. Joe Biden blaming a hectic travel schedule for his poor performance in a debate last week that sparked renewed speculation over his ability to run for a second term. The president's troubles further exacerbated by a report in the New York Times citing US and foreign officials expressing concern over a series of instances in which he seemed to be struggling. Bloomberg TV anchor Kriti Gupta is with us for more on this. Kriti, these reports add to comments that we've heard from prominent Democrats like Nancy Pelosi, who seem openly worried about Biden's health. How significant is this drumbeat of commentary?
It's definitely significant, and it's been growing as opposed to fading since the debate, and that is a problem for a lot of Biden's camp. It's bringing up questions of how he actually operates within the White House himself. Reports also coming out of how his family is there's an inner circle, his family, senior aides kind of protect his real condition from being exposed to the rest of the White House staff. So concerns like that, when reporting like that comes out, it becomes a real for broader America. And you're already seeing that reflected in the polls, for example, where you are starting to see Biden's numbers drop, not only relative to President Trump, but relative to some of the other supposed candidates who could replace him, or at least have been expected to be in that running. Things like people like Gavin Newsom, Kamala Harris, et cetera, who again are not officially running, haven't even really indicated that they have that on their minds, but are still in the polls, rising a little bit. Not as high as Beau Biden, but you can certainly see the direction of travel.
OK. How are Biden and the White House responding to all of this?
Well, Joe Biden said that this is really a function of his travel schedule. We already know previously his aides have said that the poor debate performance was attributed to a cold. Even during the debate, that message from the campaign was already sent out to a lot of the media. I think in the first 20 minutes of the debate or something like that. They're trying to control the message message that even though from the outside he may not be able to be delivering it, from the inside in terms of actually executing the job, being commander-in-chief, he can make those decisions. And that's the messaging that they're sticking to.
Critty, what about the kind of the eventualities of where we go from here? What's going to push Democrats to move against Joe Biden now, or what might save his candidacy?
Well, timing is of the essence. July 21st is the date that you need to know. That is the virtual roll call from the Democratic National Convention. And that's why so much of this is ramping up, because they're trying to see whether or not they actually do want to make President Biden the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party. Now, July 21st is not the official date. It is the expected date. But basically what it does is kind of pull up the process from what would have been in the Democratic National Convention, where they would have solidified it in August, and instead bringing it up a couple of weeks just to make that Ohio ballot deadline.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.